This garden is an eyesore. It has to go.
It's not going anywhere. This is my land.
You can't keep this up. The rules are clear.
Rules don't change what's right.
Cecil Hensley never raised his voice, never picked a fight with anybody in his 74 years. But when he walked out to his garden on that August morning and saw what was left of his grandmother's tomatoes, the ones Opal had started from seeds brought down from Pocahontas County, West Virginia, back in 1948. Seeds carried in an envelope in her apron pocket. Something quiet and deep and irreversible shifted inside him. And by the time the sun came up over the Shenandoah Valley that day, Cecil had decided that Cheryl Stackhouse was going to learn a lesson about what happens when you poison a man's land at 2 in the morning, and the whole county was about to watch it unfold. The homestead sat on 12 acres of rolling red clay and limestone soil in Augusta County, Virginia, land that had been in Cecil's family since his grandfather Amos built the main house with his own hands in 1928. The farmhouse itself was a 2-story white clapboard structure with dark green shutters flanking every window, their paint peeling in spots but still standing proud. A wraparound porch ran along the front and down one side, and that porch was where Amos and his wife Pearl had sat on summer evenings, looking out over the fields that stretched toward the creek, watching the light change from gold to red to purple as the sun went down. Behind the house stood a barn built in 1936, its wood weathered to silver gray over the decades, the tin roof patched more times than anyone could count, but still standing solid, still doing its job the way honest things do. A split-rail fence marked the property line on the east side, built from black locust wood that Amos had cut himself. On the south side, where the creek ran shallow and cold even in summer, where the water sang over the rocks, the garden began. Cecil walked out every morning at 5 o'clock. Had for 52 years, without missing a day except for the time he'd had his appendix out in 1997 and was laid up for 2 weeks. The routine was unchanging as the seasons themselves. He'd pull his boots on in the kitchen before anyone else was awake, the leather worn soft at the toe from thousands of mornings just like this one, the heel scuffed and creased from 52 years of stepping into them in the dark. He'd reach for his cap, a faded green John Deere cap that had belonged to his father before him, and he'd step out into the dark with his mind already in the rows, already thinking about what needed doing, what was growing, what was ready to harvest. The screen door would slap behind him with the same soft bang it had made since 1968, when he and Hazel put it in after the old one rusted through. The coffee was always already brewing before he got back inside. None of that instant business. None of those plastic pod machines that his daughter tried to convince him about every time she visited. When Cecil needed coffee, he made it real. He'd fill the old metal percolator with water, add the grounds, and set it on the stove at 4:30. By the time he came back from the garden, it would be ready, the smell drifting through the kitchen and out onto the porch, mixing with the honeysuckle that grew wild along the fence line and the smell of the hay stored in the barn for the 2 horses he kept more for company than any practical reason. Those horses had names, Duke and Molly, and they'd been there for 12 and 14 years, respectively. The garden itself was half an acre, maybe a little less when you actually measured it, split into 23 rows separated by paths of packed dirt that Cecil raked smooth twice a year, once in spring and once in early summer. He didn't use much machinery in there, mostly his hands and a hoe that had belonged to his father and his father before him, the wood handle smooth from decades of use, the blade still sharp because Cecil kept it sharp. The heirloom tomatoes took up the back 8 rows, the most protected part of the garden, the part that got the afternoon sun, but not the harsh western exposure. There were brandywines that grew big as a man's fist and tasted like summer, and memory that tasted like the way food was supposed to taste before everything got hybridized for shipping and shelf life. Cherokee purples with their deep, almost black skin and the way they were heavy as stones when ripe, with that sweet acid tang that made your mouth water just thinking about it. And the Opal's golds, that was what the family called them, the ones with the yellow skin that came from somewhere in the deep orange range. The ones that glowed like little lanterns when the morning light hit them just right during those hours after sunrise and before 10 o'clock. Those were the ones that came from Opal herself, back in 1948. Seeds she carried in an envelope in her apron pocket when she and Cecil's grandfather settled this land and built this life together. In front of the tomatoes were the pepper plants, everything from long hot ones he'd dry and hang from the barn rafters in braids that looked like they belonged in a Mexican kitchen, to sweet bells that Hazel would roast in the oven with garlic and oil until they were soft and blackened and tasted like harvest. The squash ran along the south fence in a tangle of vines that spread wider every July, the plants flowering with those big yellow blooms that looked almost obscene in their abundance. Herbs grew in a raised bed that his grandson had built from reclaimed barnwood, wood that must have been 50 years old at least. Basil, rosemary, thyme, sage, dill, marjoram, all of them growing thick and fragrant enough that just walking past them cleared your sinuses and made you remember why people had cooked with fresh herbs for thousands of years before they invented dried ones in jars. The raspberry bushes occupied the northwest corner, canes that were descendants of the original plants his grandmother had set out in 1951, and they produced fruit for maybe 4 weeks in June and early July. Berries that were so perfect they fell apart in your hand if you squeezed them even slightly. And on the east side, the roses. There was a trellis, weather-beaten but sturdy, built from dogwood branches and cypress wood, where a climbing rose bloomed every June without fail. That rose had been planted in 1953 by his mother Etta on her wedding day, planted as a gift from her new husband Cecil's father. It was a soft pink variety, almost salmon-colored when the morning light hit it just right, and it had survived every winter since, had bloomed through droughts and ice storms and heat waves that made people say the world was ending. It had survived neglect in the 1970s when Cecil was working 2 jobs and couldn't give it the attention it deserved. It had survived the hard freeze of 1985 that killed trees all over the county. It was a living thing that connected Cecil to his mother, to his father, who planted it, to his grandfather, who built the trellis, to a line of people stretching back into time, and it bloomed faithfully every June with flowers the color of sunrise. Hazel, his wife of 48 years, came out most mornings to help him in the early light before the heat built up too much and made the work miserable. She was 2 years younger than Cecil, 71 now, with silver hair she wore in a braid down her back and reading glasses on a chain around her neck that she'd pull on to check the ripeness of the tomatoes, to see if the basil was ready for cutting, to look at the calendar she kept pinned to the barn door with notes about what needed planting when. Every August, Hazel did the canning, a ritual that had grown into a kind of sacred responsibility over the years. 40 jars some years, sometimes 50, lined up on the basement shelves in rows like soldiers. Tomato sauce, diced tomatoes, salsa. She learned to make from a Mennonite woman who used to live down the road, and who had taught her the exact proportions of cilantro and lime juice. The jars went to the church potluck in October, to the food bank in town, to neighbors and family, to anyone who needed good food, put up by someone who cared about doing it right. It was Hazel's gift to the county, and she took it seriously, testing pH levels, following recipes exactly, never cutting corners on timing or temperature. Their granddaughter Lily came out on Saturday mornings when she wasn't in school during the regular term, and during the summer, she came out almost every day if she could, with her mother's permission. She was 9 years old, gap-toothed and sun-darkened from spending every weekend in the garden, her blonde hair turning lighter every summer from the sun. Cecil had given her a patch that was all her own, 3 tomato plants and a row of zinnias that she tended with the seriousness of a farmer 3 times her age. She came out with her measuring tape and made sure the plants got exactly as much water as they needed, exactly the right amount of sun, exactly the spacing that Cecil had taught her. Cecil had never had to tell her twice about anything, and she understood, the way some people just do without being taught, that growing things is a sacred responsibility, that plants depend on you, that you can't skip days just because you don't feel like working. The land had been open country for a long time, all of it. Pastures and woods and creek running free and sky that went on forever in every direction. Then about 2 years ago, right around the time Cecil turned 72, the developers came. They came with their trucks and their surveying equipment and their plans. They bought the old Miller farm, which sat on the other side of a thin line of trees from Cecil's property, maybe a quarter mile of forest separating the two. They looked at 84 house lots and they saw money. They cut it into 84 parcels with street signs and sidewalks and a community mailbox. They called it Creekview Estates, like that name meant something, like it connected them to something real instead of being just a marketing term. They built the houses fast, cheap, with white vinyl siding and 2-car garages and tiny yards. They put in street signs with names like Oakwood Drive and Creekview Lane, even though there wasn't an oak tree on the whole development. and the creek was 3/4 of a mile away. They formed an HOA, and they elected a woman named Cheryl Stackhouse to run it. Cheryl had moved from Fairfax County after her divorce from a man who, according to town gossip, had taken the house and the car and most of the savings, leaving her with the retirement accounts and the alimony. She'd bought the biggest house in Creekview Estates with her settlement money, the one at the center of everything. 3 stories with a 3-car garage and a long driveway where she kept a white Mercedes sedan. She was 58 years old, and she dressed like someone trying to prove she was still 40. Blonde hair, probably not all her own, that she had styled every Thursday at a salon in the shopping center in the next town over. She drove 20 minutes to get her hair done, which told you something about how seriously she took her appearance. Hot pink blazer that she wore to every HOA meeting, the kind of blazer that probably cost more than Cecil's monthly car payment. Black skirt and heels, always heels. Even on the gravel streets of Creekview, even when she was walking down to somebody's house to file a complaint, which seemed to be frequently, she carried a clipboard everywhere she went, the way some people carry a phone, with printed copies of bylaws and regulations and her own notes written in red ink. She had decided, almost immediately upon moving in, that Cecil Hensley and his homestead were problems that needed solving, not problems the way other people might see problems, like the fact that 3 houses in Creekview still didn't have their landscaping finished after 2 years, or the community pool pump that had been broken since May. She saw Cecil's land as a problem. The first letter came in May, about 3 months after she'd taken over as HOA president, which was a position she'd essentially appointed herself to by showing up at the first meeting with a 3-ring binder full of bylaws she'd written herself. It was on Creekview Estates HOA letterhead, fancy white text on a dark blue background, looking official and serious. It said that Cecil's compost pile, which sat on his own property, roughly 200 yards from the nearest HOA lot line, was producing offensive odors that may impact adjacent property values and community standards. It was signed by Cheryl Stackhouse, HOA president, in pen that looked like it cost money. Cecil read it on the porch, sitting in his chair in the morning light, and handed it to Hazel. She read it and said what Hazel always said when something was obvious. "Well, it is compost. Of course it smells." Cecil folded it carefully and stuck it in the kitchen drawer where he kept old bills and tax returns. The second letter came 3 weeks later, in early June. This one was about the scarecrows. Cecil kept 3 of them in the garden, dressed in old clothes that didn't fit him anymore, hats stuffed with newspaper, standing there doing their job of keeping the birds away from the ripening fruit. They'd been there for 40 years, and they worked better than netting or any of the modern contraptions. The letter said they were unsightly and inconsistent with contemporary community aesthetic standards. Cheryl wanted them removed immediately, per the bylaws. Cecil kept this letter in the drawer too, next to the one about the compost. The third letter, in early July, was about the beehives. Cecil kept 4 of them, had since 1991, had registered them with the Virginia Department of Agriculture, and kept all the documentation in a folder in his desk. He sold some honey at the farmer's market, gave most of it away to friends and family and the church. The letter called them a safety hazard and demanded their removal, claiming that they represented a threat to community children and pets. Per the bylaws, the letter said. Those 2 words, per the bylaws, would become familiar. Cecil kept this letter in the drawer too. Then Cheryl came in person. She walked across the property line in her black heels, picking her way across the grass like it was beneath her dignity, like she might get mud on the shoes that probably cost $200. It was a Tuesday afternoon in mid-July, sunny and clear. He was coming back from the garden with a basket of vegetables, basil and summer squash and green beans, when he saw her approaching the gate at the end of his driveway. Hazel was on the porch, and she watched as Cecil set the basket down and walked over to meet Cheryl at the gate, his hand extended in greeting the way his mother had taught him. "Mr. Hensley," Cheryl said, not waiting for him to say hello, not shaking his hand, just standing there with her clipboard hugged against her chest. "I've written you 3 letters regarding violations that directly impact our community standards. I'd like to discuss your willingness to come into compliance." Cecil was polite. Cecil was always polite, even when he was angry, maybe especially then. He said, "I appreciate you coming by, but I ain't in your HOA. This here's my land, been my family's land for 3 generations now. My grandfather built the house with his own hands. The standards affect everyone, Cheryl said, her head tilted the way it always was when she was explaining something to someone she thought wasn't quite getting it. It was a condescending tilt, the kind that made you feel talked down to. Whether you're officially in the community or not, your property affects property values. The appearance of your land affects all of us, Cecil said, his voice steady and quiet the way it always was. Ma'am, I was here before there was anything to have standards about. I've been planting this garden since before you were born, since before this whole subdivision even existed. My grandmother Opal planted those first tomatoes in 1948. I ain't changing what I've been doing for 70 years because somebody decided to move out here and make rules. Cheryl's jaw tightened, the hand holding the clipboard tightened. She stood there for another moment, and then she turned and walked back to her house, her heels clicking on the gravel driveway. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you're new to the HOA Trap, go ahead and subscribe, because this story is proof that you should never mess with a man who knows every inch of his own dirt. After that face-to-face meeting, Cheryl escalated. She wasn't done. She filed official complaints with county code enforcement. She called the health department and reported the bees as a public safety hazard. She contacted the county agricultural extension office about the compost, claiming it violated sanitation codes. She went to county board meetings with printed photographs of Cecil's property, blown up to large format, trying to make the garden look as bad as possible, claiming adjacent blight, and arguing that his non-compliance with community standards was dragging down the whole area, threatening property values for miles around. She testified for nearly 30 minutes at one meeting, her heels clicking on the tile floor in the courthouse, her voice getting sharper as she made her points. She had charts, she had photos, she had spreadsheets showing supposed property value impacts. She was organized and she was determined. She cited bylaws that had no jurisdiction over his property. She quoted community standards that didn't apply outside the subdivision. She talked about the children and the bees, about the safety implications, about her vision for the county becoming a place where standards mattered. The county clerk, Ruth Ann Pritchard, had gone to high school with Cecil, had sat 2 desks behind him in chemistry class in 1966, had always liked him because he was quiet and kind and never made fun of anybody. She looked at Cheryl's request to reclassify his property as commercial agricultural enterprise, which would have allowed for more strict regulation and easier enforcement, and she very politely declined. She knew the law. She knew Cecil's land. She knew his family history. She knew that nothing was out of order, that everything he was doing had been legal for 50 years, that reclassification would be a misuse of county authority. Mr. Hensley's property is grandfathered, she told Cheryl in the simplest language she could manage. It predates the subdivision by decades. Code enforcement sent out a man named Greg, who was maybe 35 years old, wore the county uniform with its patches and insignia, and was professional and fair. He spent an afternoon at Cecil's property checking the beehives, inspecting the compost setup, looking at the garden and the barn and the condition of the structures. He took notes. He took measurements. When he left, he found Cecil on the porch reading the paper. Greg said, "Mr. Hensley, your property is cleaner than most new builds I inspect. Everything's up to code. Your bees are registered with the state. You've got the paperwork for everything. You're in good standing with every county regulation I know about. I don't know what the HOA is complaining about, but there's nothing here that violates county code, nothing here that violates state law. You're doing everything right." Cecil thanked him. The county board listened to Cheryl politely, took her concerns under advisement, and did nothing. The board members were farmers themselves, or the children of farmers, or married to farmers. They understood what land meant. They understood that heritage was worth protecting. They voted unanimously to take no action regarding Cecil's property, but Cheryl kept pushing. She started showing up at community events, church dinners where she'd corner people and give them the whole spiel about community standards. The farmers market on Saturday mornings, where she'd approach customers buying Cecil's tomatoes and tell them about the safety concerns. The diner on Main Street where the same people had been sitting in the same booths for 20 years, ordering the same breakfast, sharing the same stories. At Tommy's Diner, a place called Tommy's where the coffee was always hot and the pie was always good, people started talking about Cheryl. Can you believe she's going after Cecil Hensley? His family's been on that land since FDR was president. His grandmother brought seeds from West Virginia back in 1948, back when you had to travel by train to get anywhere. The consensus, unspoken but clear as water, was that Cheryl didn't understand how things worked out here. She didn't understand that some people owned land because they loved it, not because they were trying to sell it. She didn't understand that a heritage garden wasn't a liability, it was a treasure. Some of the Creekview neighbors started to feel awkward about the whole thing. A few of them, like a woman named Connie who lived 3 lots over from the main road, had actually bought tomatoes from Cecil at the farmer's market. They'd tasted those brandy wines. They'd bit into those Cherokee purples and experienced that combination of acid and sweetness that you can't get from supermarket tomatoes. They knew what that garden meant. A couple of them even came to one of the HOA meetings and suggested that maybe the focus should be on actual problems in the development, like the fact that 3 houses still didn't have their landscaping finished, and the community pool pump had been broken for 2 months, and there was a water leak somewhere that kept the street wet. Cheryl went quiet for a little while after that, but it was the quiet kind where you know someone is planning something, plotting, thinking about how to get what they want when the normal channels aren't working. Then came the last week of July, and the weather got hot. Not just hot, dangerous hot. The kind of heat that makes the asphalt soft and sends old people to sit in air-conditioned churches with their families and makes farmers check their irrigation systems obsessively, walking the fields in the early morning and late evening to make sure every plant is getting water. The thermometer hit 95 degrees, then 97, then one day climbed to 101 degrees Fahrenheit. And the sky turned that washed-out white-blue color it gets when it's too hot for clouds to form, when the atmosphere is just too unstable. Cecil woke up at 4:30 on that second week of August, the hottest week in a decade according to the weatherman, the hottest week since records had been kept for the county. He went through his morning routine the way he always did, boots, hat, coffee, out to the garden before 5 o'clock. The air was already warm, already damp, even at that early hour, heavy with moisture even though the sky was clear. The ground felt hard-baked under his feet, the kind of hard that comes from no rain and intense sun day after day. But the garden itself looked okay. The tomatoes had some droop, natural in this heat, but nothing alarming. He checked the soaker hoses. They were running steady, the water seeping slowly into the soil exactly the way it should. The drip system he'd installed 3 years ago was doing its job, keeping everything alive even in the worst heat. He came back in for breakfast at 6 o'clock. Hazel had scrambled eggs and toast ready, and they sat at the kitchen table like they had for 48 years. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The sun started coming up, and the light came through the east window the way it always did, catching the dust motes, turning them golden. By 10 o'clock, Cecil walked back out to get some basil for lunch, some fresh basil that Hazel was going to use for the pasta she was making. That's when he noticed it. The brandy wines in the 3rd row weren't just wilted from heat, they were dying. Not the natural kind of droop that comes from heat stress and gets better when the sun goes down and the temperature drops. The kind of dying that comes from something being fundamentally wrong, something systemic, something that's killing the plant from the inside out. The leaves were yellow-gray, that unhealthy color you see in plants that are being poisoned. The fruit had started to shrivel on the vine, to lose its turgidity, to become small and hard and unfit to eat. Cecil knelt down, pulled a leaf, crushed it between his fingers. No smell of disease, no smell of fungus or rot. Something chemical. Something wrong. He checked the Cherokee purples. Same problem. Worse, actually. 3 of the plants were already past saving, their main stems brown and brittle. The peppers were wilting dramatically. The herbs, the basil that had been so thick and fragrant just yesterday, so alive, so vibrant green, were turning black. The rosemary, which had survived every winter for the past 32 years, every drought, every late freeze, every ice storm that came down from the mountains, was gray and shriveled like it had been dead for weeks, like all the life had been drained out of it. Cecil dug into the soil at the base of the tomato plants with his fingers, not bothering with tools. It felt different, gritty, chemical, not right. He brought a handful up to his nose and smelled it. His face went still. He knew that smell. Herbicide. Something strong. Something that wasn't supposed to be here. Something that should never be here. He'd used herbicides on the gravel driveway, had used them on the barn foundation to keep weeds from getting under the structure. He knew what herbicide smelled like. He walked the length of the garden methodically, plant by plant, row by row, all of it. The beans gone, the squash dying, the pepper plants collapsing, the herbs, most of them anyway, turned to gray compost already, defeated. And then he reached the east side, where the trellis was, where his mother's rose had bloomed every June for 71 years without missing a single year. The rose was dead, not dying, dead. Completely, irreversibly dead. The canes were brown and brittle, the kind of brittle that comes from dehydration at the cellular level. The leaves had fallen. The flower buds that should have been developing for next spring were black and withered, shriveled up like raisins. It was a corpse. Something that had been alive and full of potential was just gone, erased, destroyed. Cecil stood there for a long time, his hat in his hands, the sun climbing higher, the heat pressing down. The sounds of the morning, the birds, the creek, the wind through the trees, all of it fading into background noise as he stared at what had been his mother's rose. Hazel found him an hour later, still standing there, looking at the dead trellis, at the empty space where his mother's roses should have been climbing toward the August sky. "Come inside, Cecil," she said. Her voice was gentle and worried. "Come get some water." He could barely speak. "Those were Mama's roses," he said. "She planted them in 1953, 53 to today, 71 years. Hazel took his hand and led him inside. They sat at the kitchen table without speaking. The coffee was cold. Lily came on Saturday like she always did, riding her bike over from her house 2 miles away, her backpack bouncing on her shoulders. She came out to her patch and stopped, looking confused. The tomato plants were wilting. The zinnias were dying. She stood there for a moment, and then understanding hit her. She started crying, not the small tears of disappointment, big crying. The kind that comes when something you've built and worked on and cared for is destroyed by something outside your control. Cecil came out of the barn and saw her there, standing in the middle of her patch, tears running down her sunburned face, her hands clenched into fists. He walked over and knelt down beside her. She was 9 years old, and she was looking at the thing she had built, her own garden, her own responsibility, her own small piece of the world, and it was destroyed. "I didn't do nothing wrong," she said, her voice breaking. "I did everything right. I measured the water. I checked the sun. I did everything you taught me." Cecil pulled her close and said, "I know you did, honey. I know you did everything right. We're gonna fix this. We're gonna make it right. I promise you." That night, Hazel sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee, just holding it, not drinking. She was watching through the window as Cecil stood in the dark garden, just standing there, not doing anything. Just standing there with his cap in his hand and his shoulders slumped. She didn't try to bring him inside again. Some things a person has to feel on their own. Some sorrows can't be shared. She watched him for a long time, long enough for the sun to go all the way down, long enough for the stars to come out over the garden. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, share it and subscribe to the HOA Trap, because what Cecil does next is why you should never underestimate a quiet man with a dead garden and a long memory. Monday morning, Cecil got in. His 1987 Ford F-150, the truck he'd bought used in 1990, the truck that had probably 30,000 miles on it now, the truck that had hauled feed and hay and supplies for 34 years. He drove downtown to Protter's Feed and Seed. The store sat on Main Street in a brick building that had been there since the 1950s. The paint faded, the windows dusty, but clean. Vernon Prater was behind the counter, 76 years old, a Vietnam vet who had come back from the war in 1968 and never left the county, who had run this store for 53 years and knew every farmer within 30 miles, knew their families, knew their problems, knew what they needed before they knew they needed it. "You look like somebody shot your dog," Vernon said when he saw Cecil's face. They went back far enough that Vernon could read Cecil like a book. "Worse," Cecil said. "Somebody killed my garden. Somebody poured herbicide all over it. The tomatoes, the herbs, the roses my mama planted in 1953. All of it, everything that was alive, is dead." Vernon didn't say anything right away. He just listened, the way people who've known each other for 70 years can do. He listened while Cecil told him about the dying plants, about the chemical smell in the soil, about the way the leaves had turned yellow-gray and gray-black, about the rose that had bloomed since 1953 being nothing but brown sticks now. When Cecil finished, Vernon walked to the back of the store and came back with a device, a trail camera. It was a small thing, black plastic, maybe the size of a paperback book. Cost $47. Same thing I use for deer, Vernon said. Motion activated, infrared, night vision, sees perfect in the dark. Battery lasts 6 months. If somebody comes back, you'll know. You'll have proof. Cecil looked at it. He turned it over in his hands. It was light, simple, effective. I'll take 2, Cecil said. He also bought 2 more spools of heirloom tomato plants, young ones, not yet hardened off, needing weeks to be ready. He bought basil seeds and rosemary plants. He was going to replant, but first he was going to watch. First he was going to know who did this. That evening, as the sun was going down, he and Vernon mounted the cameras. One went on a fence post at the back of the garden, hidden behind a tangle of dead bean vines, positioned so it could see the whole back section. One went on the barn wall, angled to cover the whole plot from a different angle, creating overlapping coverage. Then Cecil bought some young seedlings from a nursery in town and put them in the soil, replacing the ones that had died with fresh plants, 2 rows of tomato plants, a few herbs, just enough to look like the garden was recovering, just enough to provide a reason for someone to come back if they were inclined to. He didn't tell Hazel. He just told her he was going to replant and he'd do it in his own time, that he needed some time to think. He didn't tell her about the cameras, just Vernon knew, Vernon and no one else, and then he waited. If you're watching the HOA Trap right now, hit that like button. It's free, takes 1 second, and helps this story reach more folks who know what it's like to have somebody come after something you've spent your whole life building. Now, back to the story. 4 days went by. Nothing but the normal sounds of the night. The cameras caught a raccoon the first night, going through the garden looking for grubs and insects, its eyes bright in the infrared. A stray cat the second night, hunting mice. A deer the third night, stepping delicately through the rows, eating the tips off the tomato plants. Just wildlife doing what wildlife does. The new plants sat in the ground, waiting to grow. On the 5th night, Thursday night, just after 2 in the morning, the northwest camera triggered. Then the barn camera. Then both of them multiple times. Motion. Somebody was in the garden at 2 in the morning. Cecil woke to the notification on his phone. Vernon had set it up to alert him. He got up and went to the laptop. The timestamp read 2:17:14. The video showed a figure coming out of the tree line that separated Cecil's property from Creekview Estates. Blonde hair, even in the darkness, a bathrobe, blue or purple or dark something. Definitely a bathrobe. Tennis shoes, not those black heels. A white plastic 1-gallon jug in her hands. A jug of something. It was Cheryl Stackhouse. And she was walking methodically through the rows of Cecil's replanted garden, and at each plant, she was pouring liquid from that jug. Not rushing, not panicking, not afraid, like it was a chore, like something she'd done before, like she was entitled to walk through a man's garden in the middle of the night and poison what he planted. Her face was visible. You could see it clear. You could see the concentration on her face, the focus. The barn camera caught her from another angle, both her face and the jug and the pouring motion and the timestamp at the bottom of the screen. 2 minutes and 43 seconds of video. Clear, undeniable, professional, everything a person could need. Cecil watched the video twice. He didn't say anything. He closed the laptop. He sat very still. The kind of still that comes before action. The kind of still that means someone has made a decision, and there's no taking it back. He sat in the dark living room, watching the shadows on the wall, and he made a choice. He poured a cup of coffee even though the sun wasn't up yet, the sun being still hours away, the darkness still complete. He sat on the porch and watched the sky lighten from black to gray, to that pale yellow that comes just before dawn. He watched the stars disappear. He watched the world wake up. The anger he felt wasn't the hot kind that burns quick and dies. It was the cold kind, the deep kind, the kind that burns long and steady and doesn't quit. When Hazel came out an hour before sunrise, finding him still sitting there, still watching the darkness turn to light, she didn't ask what was wrong. She just sat down next to him and took his hand. "It's taken care of," Cecil said. She nodded. She didn't ask what he meant. She didn't need to. Monday morning, after spending the weekend in a kind of quiet, determined state, Cecil drove to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Dale McCoy was a big man, 55 years old, broad shoulders, crew cut, going gray. He'd grown up in the county. He and Cecil weren't close, but they had been in church together for 30 years. McCoy was fair, by the book. He would do what was right. Cecil told him what had happened, the garden dying, the chemical in the soil, the cameras. McCoy's expression didn't change as Cecil talked, his face remaining professional and neutral. But when Cecil got done, when he pulled out the laptop and showed the video, when McCoy watched it twice and saw Cheryl Stackhouse walking through the garden with the jug, pouring herbicide on the plants, the sheriff said, "You documented it all?" "I got it on camera," Cecil said. "2 angles, clear as day. I also got the soil tested." McCoy had his deputy pull a soil sample from the garden that afternoon. They took samples from where the herbicide was heaviest, from around the base of the dead plants. The lab came back 3 days later, saying glyphosate at 8 times normal levels. That's the active ingredient in Roundup and a dozen other herbicide products. That's something you'd buy at a hardware store or a garden center. The law in Virginia was clear. Destruction of agricultural crops with a value over $1,000 was a Class 6 felony. Cecil had documented his damage on a yellow legal pad, writing in his careful, neat handwriting. Heirloom seed stock going back to 1948, the genetics and the knowledge and the history. $4,800. Mature plants he'd spent years developing, costing money to replace and time to regrow. $3,200. His mother's rose, planted in 1953. 71 years of blooming, irreplaceable. $2,400. Soil remediation and replacement, $3,800. Total, $14,200. McCoy watched the video a second time. He watched it frame by frame. He watched Cheryl's face as she poured the herbicide. Then he said, "This footage is solid. You did this right. You didn't try to take matters into your own hands. You didn't go after her. You documented everything. You reported it to us. You let the law handle it. That's the right way to do it, Mr. Hensley. That's the way things should work." Cecil said, "My grandmother always said if you want to catch a fox, you don't chase it. You just watch where it goes." The deputy ran the soil tests. Glyphosate, 8 times normal levels. That was enough. Sheriff McCoy drove to Creekview Estates on a Tuesday afternoon. He drove slowly, not in any hurry, his cruiser moving at a steady pace through the subdivision. He parked in front of Cheryl Stackhouse's house, the one with the 3-car garage and the circular driveway, the one at the center of everything. 3 neighbors saw the sheriff pull up. One of them pretended to water some flowers, trying to look casual but watching everything. 2 of them just stood there and watched openly. Cheryl opened the door in her hot pink blazer, clipboard under her arm, probably headed to another HOA meeting. She opened the door and saw the sheriff standing there in his brown uniform, and her face went white. McCoy said, "Cheryl, I need to talk to you about what happened to Cecil Hensley's garden." Cheryl's face went white, then it went red. Then she said, "This is absurd. This is ridiculous. I'm the HOA president. I was maintaining community standards. That man's property is a blight on the entire area." "His property isn't in your HOA," McCoy said. His voice was calm and steady. "His property predates your subdivision by 3 generations, and I've got you on 2 different cameras from 2 different angles at 2 in the morning in a bathrobe pouring herbicide on his plants. We've tested the soil. We know what was poured. We know when." The bathrobe detail hit different than the felony charge. It was the detail that made it real. It wasn't about community standards anymore. It was about a woman in her nightclothes, sneaking onto a neighbor's property in the dead of night, poisoning plants deliberately and with malice. Cheryl said, "I want to call my lawyer." Her voice had changed. It was smaller now, less certain. McCoy read her the charges: criminal trespassing, destruction of agricultural property over $1,000, a Class 6 felony, unlawful application of herbicide. He asked her to come with him to the station to make a statement. He asked her if she wanted to call her lawyer. Cecil had asked him not to use handcuffs if it came to that. McCoy was a decent man. He respected the request. Cheryl wasn't resisting. She just walked to the cruiser with McCoy, her blonde hair and her hot pink blazer moving in the afternoon sun, and they drove away. 3 neighbors had watched the whole thing. By evening, the whole county knew. Not the version Cheryl would have wanted them to know, but the real version. The version with the bathrobe and the herbicide jug, and a woman who thought she could decide what happened on land that wasn't hers. That night, the Creekview HOA held an emergency meeting. Word had gotten out. The board members were nervous. Howard, one of the board members, stood up and said, "I moved here for the quiet life. I'm resigning effective immediately." 2 other board members said the same thing. They weren't going to be part of this anymore. They weren't going to defend someone who poisoned a man's garden at 2 in the morning. The compliance committee, which had been nothing but rubber stamping Cheryl's complaints, was dissolved. The board passed a resolution distancing itself from any of Cheryl's prior actions. 67 of 84 homeowners signed a petition to dissolve the HOA completely. 30 days later, after a vote, it was done. The HOA ceased to exist. No more meetings, no more bylaws, no more community standards. If the HOA Trap has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple bucks a month keeps these stories coming and helps us bring you more tales of people who tried to impose their will and learned the hard way that some people don't bend. Cheryl pled guilty to all charges in October. She got 2 years probation, had to pay Cecil restitution in the amount of $14,200, and had to do 300 hours of community service, which meant working at the county environmental service office, picking up litter on the roadsides. She received a lifetime restraining order that meant she could never come within 1,000 yards of Cecil's property or his family. Judge Patricia Keene was a farm girl herself from Rockbridge County, land people who understood what land meant, who understood heritage. At the sentencing, she said, looking directly at Cheryl, "A 76-year heritage garden is not just vegetables. It's living history. It's the record of a family and a place and generations of knowledge passed down. And you killed it in your bathrobe. You're lucky Mr. Hensley is the patient man he is. You're lucky this county values the rule of law." 2 weeks after sentencing, the for sale sign went up on Cheryl's house. Word spread that she was leaving. She'd sold the house to pay the restitution and whatever legal fees she'd accumulated. It sold in 43 days to a quiet couple from Richmond who had moved out to the country to get away from the city, to have peace and quiet, who had no opinion about anybody else's garden and no interest in telling anyone else how to live their life. Cecil spent the fall fixing the soil. He dug out the contaminated topsoil by hand, wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow, dawn to dusk, sometimes working long after the sun went down under the light of a work lamp. It took 6 weeks. His back was sore every night. Hazel would put liniment on his shoulders, and he'd go to bed and wake up and do it again. It was hard work, the kind that reminds you that you're not as young as you used to be, that your back has limits, that there's a cost to everything. Vernon's cousin Ray brought 3 truckloads of clean topsoil in his dump truck, no charge, just showed up one morning without being asked and dumped it in piles across the contaminated areas. That was the way people did things out here. You helped when someone needed help. The church organized a community replanting day in late October. They announced it at Sunday service. "Cecil Hensley's garden needs replanting," the pastor said. "If you can spare a Saturday morning, come help." 14 people showed up. Not all of them were from Creekview. Some were neighbors from further out, people who'd known Cecil for decades. Some were people from town who'd just heard about what happened and wanted to help. They spent a Saturday morning replanting. Tomato seedlings in the rows where Opal's golds had bloomed. Basil and rosemary and dill going in carefully, pressed down into the fresh soil. People talking quietly, working with purpose, understanding that they were part of something important. Connie from Creekview brought a climbing rose start. It wasn't the same variety as the one Cecil's mother had planted. It was a deep coral color, almost salmon, and it would take time to mature and climb the trellis. But it would grow. That was the important thing. It would live and climb and bloom. That was what mattered. That night, when everyone had gone home and the light was fading, Cecil and Lily stood at the trellis together. He'd hung a small plaque on it, brass, with words engraved. It said, "Edda's Garden, 1953 to 2024, still growing." Lily said, "Grandpa, is the mean lady coming back?" "No, honey," Cecil said. "She's not coming back. She can't come back. And these tomatoes are going to be the best ones yet, better than before." Spring came, the way it always does. The world turned green again. The rose start put out leaves. By May, it had developed buds. In June, it bloomed. Not Etta's rose, which would have taken years to recover, and which, in the end, never did fully recover from the herbicide damage, but a different rose, a living rose, growing on the trellis that Cecil had built and maintained and protected. The garden came back strong, stronger maybe than it had been in years. The heirloom tomatoes grew bigger than they had in years. The herbs came back thick and fragrant. Hazel did her canning in August, just like always. This year, she made 42 jars, new record. The basement shelf filled up with them. Lily won a blue ribbon at the county fair for her Opal's Golds. The tomatoes were perfect, deep red, full size, tasting exactly like summer should taste. Cecil cut out the photograph from the newspaper and taped it to the refrigerator next to a photo from 1952, showing Opal herself standing in the garden with her hands on her hips, looking proud, looking like she'd built something worth building. The trail cameras hung on a shelf in the barn now, just a reminder, just a tool that had been useful once and might be useful again. They'd served their purpose. Some folks spend their whole lives trying to kill what they don't understand. And some folks just keep planting. Thank you for watching this story. If it reminded you that patience and a good trail camera beat a clipboard every time, please share it. Subscribe to the HOA Trap for more stories about people who knew their ground better than anyone who tried to take it from them. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you caught someone poisoning your garden on camera?